Our last learning objective for this chapter is looking at pedigrees, which are ways of mapping different genetic traits throughout families. So you can see where we find traits in autosomes, which are non-sex chromosomes, or the 22 pairs that do not determine whether you are male or female, and X-linked traits, which are the ones that are found on the X chromosome. So, we haven't talked a lot about human traits in terms of Mendelian characteristics. I guess we talked about blood type and Huntington's disease and hemophilia. But understanding the genetic basis for disease is something that we're interested in, but not something that we can necessarily do a lot of experimentation with directly, because it's unethical to breed humans for these types of experiments, and that's far and away the most important reason. But there's some practical issues as well. Human generation time is too long. It takes at least a couple of decades for humans to reach the age in which they're capable of producing children and caring for them. When we reproduce, we do not reproduce dozens and dozens of offspring at a time. So it's not easy for us to try and look at Mendelian inheritance in the same way that Mendel did, looking at humans. But we are very interested in how certain genetic disorders are inherited. So how do we study these traits ethically? One way that we can do that is by performing what's called pedigree analysis. And a pedigree is a diagram of a family tree that shows the interrelationships of parents and children across generations. And this is something that you're going to be doing for your second mini project. We're going to look at inheritance patterns, not of any particular diseases, but of certain genetic markers. So inheritance patterns of particular traits can be traced and described using pedigrees. Okay, so here are a couple of different pedigrees, and what you can see is that the way that they're drawn is they're just like a family tree. So here's your key up here. Males are shown as squares, females are shown as circles. And instead of saying diseased or something like that, we use the term affected, because not all of these traits are necessarily things that you would attribute some sort of pathological disorder to, but they might be something as simple as whether or not somebody's got a widow's peak, which is just a little point of hair coming off of the forehead. So this lady's got a point of hair called a widow's peak, and this lady here has a flat hairline, straight hairline, no widow's peak. Likewise, earlobes may be attached, they may be free, but that's not really something that we would consider something that you need to go to the doctor for. You would not need to get treatment for having a free earlobe or an attached earlobe. So more broadly, we can say that somebody is affected. Okay, so if we have a line, a horizontal line connecting a male and a female, that suggests a marriage or a mating. And then we can drop a vertical line down from that mating to depict the offspring. So the offspring are drawn off of a suspended horizontal line, descended, because these are the descendants, in the birth order. So we can say in this family, if this was the mating, they had a daughter and 1, 2, 3 sons in order. Okay, so let's take a look at a practical example. Here we've got the first generation, which are the grandparents. So Here you can see here is an affected male who has whatever condition we're talking about, and an unaffected female, an unaffected male, and an affected female. All right, so in this family, second generation. So we've got an affected male who is the youngest child of these 4 siblings, and an affected female who is the older daughter. And they got married and they had these 2 daughters, and one of them has a widow's peak, and the other of which she does not have a widow's peak. So the question here is a widow's peak a dominant or a recessive trait? So by looking at the pattern of who is affected and who is not, we can try and determine whether this is a dominant trait or a recessive trait. So it's already kind of done here for us. You can see that capital W is used to indicate a widow's peak, and a lowercase w is shown to represent unaffected people who have no widow's peak. And so you can see that there are children who are genotypically having no widow's peak, even though they may have had a parent with a widow's peak. And 2 parents who both have widow's peaks may have a child who does not. And for this young woman, we can't tell whether she is homozygous or heterozygous. She could be either based on the genotypes of her parents. Okay, so we can ask the same question about attached earlobes versus unattached free earlobes. And again, they've kind of done the work for us by showing the genotypes of everyone in this family. I guess it's the same family, it looks like, but now we're mapping a different trait. We're mapping these earlobes. You can see that Grandpa over here has a free earlobe and no widow's peak. Grandma's got a widow's peak and an attached earlobe. And as you can see, both of these grandparents had this genotype that they're heterozygous. So the question is the free earlobe, I guess this is the attached earlobe is recessive and the free earlobe is dominant. So again, here's mapping the one trait, the widow's peak, and the other trait, which is the earlobe being attached or free. So we can use these pedigrees to try and map certain characteristics about future generations, and we can use what we know about genetics to determine the probability of specific phenotypes, particularly ones that may be undesirable, like hemophilia or red-green color blindness, or any of a number of other diseases that are inherited in these particular ways. So there are a lot of recessively inherited genetic disorders. They range from not very severe to life-threatening. With recessive alleles, they're only going to show up in individuals who are homozygous for that allele. Remember, I told you that carriers are heterozygous individuals. They carry the recessive allele, but phenotypically they don't have whatever disorder or condition that is. So individuals that have recessive disorders typically have parents who aren't expressing that particular condition. One such condition is albinism. Being an albino is the result of having 2 copies of that recessive allele, and it means that you don't produce melanin, a pigment, the same way that most folks do, and you don't have any pigment in your skin or hair, and you look very pale, and you have to be very careful about being out in the sun. So here are two sisters, and you can see little sis here is an albino, and big sis here is not. The parents, if they were normal, we're assuming that they're normal, were both carriers for this albinism allele. So it's also an autosomal disorder, meaning it's not sex-linked. So the likelihood of that either of these girls would have been an albino was 1/4, 25%. In the case of the older sister, she was in the 75%, and the younger sister, she was in that 25%. But every time there's a new child born, there's always going to be a 25% chance with these genetic odds. Okay, so if a recessive allele is rare, then the chances of two carriers meeting and having a child with that disorder is relatively low. So if there's no selective pressure, if there's no a disorder can be very rare, such that the parents are unlikely to both be carriers for something. However, consanguineous matings, marrying a close relative like a first cousin or a second cousin, increases the chance that a rare allele is going to be in both members of that mating. And this is one reason why most cultures have some sort of strict rules against marriage between close relatives. So you don't concentrate these rare and potentially dangerous, damaging disease disorders. However, remember I said I was going to mention something about Queen Victoria again, and hemophilia. Back in, for centuries, the crowned heads of Europe, when it was time for them to marry, they wanted to marry other royal people. And as it turned out, over a period of time, the number of royal people who were available to marry became a relatively limited number. So a lot of the crowned heads of Europe intermarried and ended up marrying people who were not such distant relatives. And because of that, hemophilia, which was present in Queen Victoria, she was a carrier, got passed down into several different royal families. You can see here that Prince Albert and Queen Victoria had, they had a daughter, Victoria. They had a son who was Edward VII, Princess Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice were all of their children. And you can see that because she did not pass that hemophilia allele onto Victoria, neither of her children were apparently affected. Edward did not receive that X chromosome. He received the other X chromosome from his mother, and therefore it was not passed on there. But then Alice got her normal X chromosome from Prince Albert and her affected X chromosome from Queen Victoria. When she married Louis here, they had a whole bunch of children, some of whom her Queen Victoria's great-grandchildren. So here's grandma, great-grandma, grandma, mom. Voldemar and Henry were both hemophiliacs. Fred was a hemophiliac. Alex was a carrier. Alexis, so this is the royal family of Russia. Alexis, the youngest son, was a hemophiliac, and so on and so forth. So again, this is why within most families that don't consider themselves to be especially isolated from other folks, you don't have a lot of consanguineous matings. And as it turns out, a lot of genetic disorders that are relatively common can be found in certain communities that tend to be very isolated from the rest of the world. Like Acadian families were fairly isolated. In Amish community, there's a lot of genetic disorders that appear again and again. Ashkenazi Jews also seem to have a lot of disorders that are rare in most other populations, and it's all because these different societies were isolated, small isolated communities where there was intermarriage, so that these diseases were passed on and kept within the very small and isolated community. So that's the end of chapter 23. And from here, we'll start talking about the chromosomal basis of inheritance and sort of the successors to Mendel.